Settle in. Let the day grow distant. Let your breath grow softer, slower, calmer. Tonight, we will wander not into battlefields, nor into chambers of kings and queens, but into the quieter corridors of their palaces. Into the rooms that most visitors never saw. Into the world of the servants. These were the men and women who kept the fires lit, who polished the marble floors, who prepared the feasts, and who whispered at the edges of history. Their names rarely made it into chronicles. Their stories were seldom carved into stone. Yet they lived in the heart of palaces, shaping the rhythm of daily life. What was it like to rise before dawn in a palace kitchen? What did it feel like to carry water through long corridors echoing with secrets? How did one sleep in a room tucked above the stables, or eat in silence at a servant's bench while the great halls glittered with gold? In this story, we will step softly into their shoes. We will explore their tasks, their rituals, and the quiet textures of their days. Close your eyes if you wish. Imagine the flicker of torchlight against stone walls, the shuffle of feet on cool floors, the hush of voices below grand staircases. And so, our journey begins. The awakening of a palace day, servants at dawn. Before the first rays of sunlight touched the palace roofs, before the roosters in the royal farms crowed, and long before the king or queen stirred beneath heavy canopies of silk, the servants were already awake. The rhythm of their lives was tied not to the clock, but to duty. A palace was a living organism, and they were its heartbeat. And like a heartbeat, it had to begin early, quietly, and without fail. A young kitchen boy might be the first to rise. His bed was a straw mattress tucked into a corner room near the kitchens, where the warmth of last night's hearth still lingered faintly. His eyelids would be heavy, his muscles stiff, but he would rise, for the fire needed tending. Without fire, no bread could be baked. Without bread, no table could be set. He would slip from his bed silently, so as not to disturb the older servants who had earned another few minutes of rest. His feet padded on cool stone, the chill of the early air wrapping around his ankles. Down in the kitchens, he would stir ashes from yesterday, coaxing sparks back to life. Soon, a faint glow would appear, then the soft crackle of wood catching flame. Elsewhere, a chambermaid tied her apron strings in the dimness of her quarters. She knew her path by memory, up the narrow servants' staircase, into the still silent royal chambers. Her task was to sweep away the dust that no one ever admitted collected there. She moved like a shadow, a broom bristling softly against the floor. She would leave the room before the lords awoke, before anyone knew she had been there at all. There were water-bearers, too, their work beginning before dawn. In some palaces, water flowed through hidden channels and pipes. In others it had to be fetched, bucket by bucket, from wells or nearby rivers. Imagine the weight of it, cool and heavy, carried up staircases and poured into basins of bronze or marble. The masters would later wash their faces in fresh water and sigh with relief, never thinking of the hands that had carried it. In the stables, grooms rose early as well. Horses had to be fed, brushed, and saddled long before the first messenger rode out or the royal carriage was prepared. The stable smell was sharp and earthy, hay mixed with the warmth of animals. A groom's hands might already be rough and raw before the sun rose, yet he would hum to the horses as he worked, keeping them calm in the stillness of morning. Servants' mornings were full of sounds that belonged only to them. The scrape of iron against stone as pots were cleaned. The rustle of straw being shifted in animal stalls. The soft sweep of rushes being laid fresh on the floor of a hall. None of these sounds were meant to disturb the noble residents above. They were the quiet chorus of invisible labor, a kind of hidden music that kept the palace alive. Meals, too, began long before the first bite was taken in the great hall. Bakers worked with dough in the half-darkness, the smell of yeast and smoke filling the kitchens. Ovens glowed red, their heat a welcome contrast to the dawn chill. Bread was shaped, salted, and set to rise, all in silence except for the soft thuds of kneading. Every palace had its own rhythm, its own order of waking. Some servants lit lanterns in corridors, others polished brass fittings so they gleamed when daylight touched them. Some swept courtyards so that the first noble steps of the day fell on clean stones. In larger palaces, hundreds of servants might stir at once, each one moving toward a task like bees in a hive. Yet for all their numbers, their presence was meant to be invisible. Their work was most successful when it went unnoticed. A fire already burning, a floor already swept, a garment already laid out, these were not luxuries, but expectations. And so the servants rose early, worked early, and disappeared early, long before the palace seemed alive to anyone else. It was a life without alarm bells or gentle wake-up calls. Their alarm was the certainty of duty. A chambermaid could not afford to sleep past her hour, nor could a scullion ignore the hearth. To fail in the morning was to risk the wrath of overseers, and in palaces, discipline was strict. A late servant could lose not only their post, but their reputation, and reputation was often the only currency the poor possessed. Still, not every dawn was heavy with dread. For some, there was a quiet peace in being the first awake. The palace, often so crowded and noisy by midday, was calm at this hour. Long hallways stretched empty, their shadows undisturbed. Courtyards glistened with dew, untouched by boots. A chambermaid might pause for a moment, broom in hand, and listen to the silence, a silence that belonged to no king, but only to those who labored beneath him. Imagine the scene: the palace wrapped in early mist, torches flickering against stone, servants moving softly from one corner to another, their tasks like small lights kindling in the darkness. The nobles still dreamed in their feather beds, unaware that an entire world of effort was already stirring to prepare their day. And in the background, the hearth kept crackling, its warmth spreading quietly into the waking palace. Bread, broth, and silence, the meals of palace servants. By the time nobles were rising from their beds, stretching beneath embroidered canopies, the servants had already been at work for hours. Their stomachs often rumbled with hunger, but meals for servants were never the first priority. Food was prepared first for the masters, then for their guests, and only after the clatter of golden plates and silver spoons faded could servants sit to eat what remained. Yet still, food was part of their rhythm, not luxurious, not abundant, but steady enough to keep limbs moving and duties fulfilled. The earliest meal was often little more than bread. Coarse, dark loaves were common in many medieval and early modern palaces. The finest white bread was reserved for kings and lords, the lighter flour sifted carefully for their tables. What remained, the denser, grainier flour, was baked into loaves for those of lower rank. A kitchen boy might break his bread with hands still dusted in ashes from the hearth. A laundress might eat hers quickly, crumbs falling into the fabric she carried. Sometimes the bread was softened with broth, sometimes with thin ale or small beer, a weak, low-alcohol brew made safer than water. Cups were shared, bowls passed from hand to hand, the taste humble but familiar. For midday, there might be pottage, a thick stew of whatever vegetables were available, simmered slowly in the kitchens. Carrots, onions, leeks, sometimes beans or lentils, flavored with herbs from the palace gardens. If the palace was wealthy, scraps of meat or bones were added, giving the broth a richer taste. Servants would not sit at long banquet tables. Instead, they gathered in side rooms, in servants' halls, or even on steps and benches tucked out of sight. Their meals were brief, eaten with speed before the next duty called. Evening meals depended on what the day had brought. In some palaces, leftovers from the nobles' feasts trickled down to the staff. The scraps might be more generous than the servants could ever afford on their own. A roasted leg, a dish of fish, a cluster of apples, cheese hardened at the edges, These, once cleared from the lord's tables, became sustenance for those who had served them. For many servants, it was the closest they would ever come to tasting the wealth they saw daily on display. But this food carried no glamour when eaten quickly, often standing or crouched, always with eyes watchful for the next command. The taste of meat mingled with the scent of polish still on their hands, the tang of smoke in their hair, the sweat of labor clinging to their clothes. Meals were rarely quiet affairs of leisure. They were snatched moments of relief. A scullery maid might laugh softly with her friend over a spoon of pottage, their voices low so as not to carry. A groom might chew bread in silence, back pressed against the stable wall, while horses shifted nearby. A chambermaid might sit on a stair, apron folded across her knees, using her lap as a makeshift plate. Hierarchy shaped their meals as much as their duties. Senior servants often ate better than juniors. A steward or lady's maid, trusted with greater responsibility, might be granted finer food, sometimes even dining in a separate room. Their plates were never as rich as those of nobles, but they carried a touch of privilege compared to the common kitchen boy or laundry girl. Even in eating, the palace reminded everyone of their place. What they ate also tied them to the rhythm of the land. In summer, meals carried fresh vegetables, fruits, herbs. In winter, dried beans, salted fish, preserved meats filled the pots. Spices, though abundant in noble kitchens, were rare at the servants' table. Instead, salt and herbs gave flavor. Bread, pottage, and ale were constants, shaping a diet that was simple but sustaining. Food was also a kind of comfort, a brief moment of warmth in long days. Imagine a maid sitting with a wooden bowl of hot broth after hours of cold labor in drafty halls. The steam rising, the first sip easing her throat, the heat spreading slowly through her body. For a few breaths, she was not invisible, not hurrying, but simply human, warm from within. But meals carried risks too. A servant caught eating at the wrong time, or taking food not given, could be punished severely. Kitchens were guarded carefully, for to steal a lord's bread was no small crime. Stories spread of servants whipped for pocketing an apple, or dismissed for sneaking a slice of meat. Hunger was constant enough that temptation lingered, yet fear of discovery kept many hands still. For some, religion shaped the meals as well. Days of fasting in Christian palaces meant no meat, only fish or vegetables. Servants were expected to follow these rules alongside their masters. During Lent, kitchens smelled of salted herring and dried peas, and servants, too, chewed their way through the lean season. The act of eating was humble, unadorned, but never meaningless. It tied the servants together in their hidden world beneath the palace splendor. They did not feast, but they shared. They did not linger, but they nourished one another with brief words, small jokes, fragments of stories exchanged over bowls. These meals, quiet and quick, were the threads that bound them through exhaustion. Picture it now, a small wooden table in a dim side room, bowls half filled, spoons scraping softly. Laughter low, weary, but genuine. Outside, nobles feasted on gilded plates, but here, in the servants' hall, warmth was drawn not from luxury but from companionship. And in the background, the pots still simmered, their steady bubbling filling the air with comfort. Threadbare aprons and quiet uniforms, the clothing of servants. When we picture a palace, we often imagine dazzling fabrics, silks that shimmered in candlelight, velvets that draped like rivers, jewels that sparkled at every turn. But if we step aside from the banquet halls and into the corridors where the servants moved, the fabric of daily life was very different. Servants did not wear silk. Their clothing was chosen not for beauty, but for utility. And yet, even in the plainest garments, their appearance mattered deeply, for in a palace, everything reflected upon its master. Most servants wore wool. It was durable, it was warm, and it could be dyed in muted colors, browns, grays, and dull greens. Linen shirts or shifts lay beneath, softer against the skin, though often patched and worn thin from repeated washing. An apron was nearly always tied at the waist, both practical and symbolic. The apron said, "This person is here to work." Shoes were plain leather, often rough and sometimes mismatched, because servants' feet endured long hours of standing and walking across stone floors. Those who worked outdoors might have heavier boots, lined with scraps of wool for warmth. Indoors, shoes scuffed quietly across rushes spread on the ground, carrying no trace of elegance, only the mark of labor. Chambermaids often wore head coverings, simple linen caps or kerchiefs tied securely, keeping hair neat and out of sight. A bare head could be seen as improper, even disrespectful. For male servants, hair was kept trimmed short, not styled with oils and powders like their masters, but clipped to show tidiness and obedience. Uniformity was important. A servant who appeared too richly dressed risked accusations of vanity, even theft. A servant too ragged could be seen as a disgrace to the household. Clothing balanced on this delicate line, plain but clean, modest but not shabby, a reflection of order and discipline. Livery was another matter altogether. In some palaces, especially in Renaissance courts, footmen, doormen, and pages wore liveries, uniforms in the colors of their master's house. Scarlet and gold, blue and white, deep green with silver trim. These garments were not theirs to own, but were issued and reclaimed by the palace. To wear livery was to become, in a sense, part of the furniture of the household, a moving, breathing emblem of noble wealth. Imagine a grand entrance hall, polished marble beneath tall windows. At the doorway, two servants in matching livery stand perfectly still, hands clasped, eyes lowered. They are as much part of the scene as the gilded mirrors on the wall, their clothing announcing not themselves, but the grandeur of the master they serve. But not every servant had such finery. Many wore the same garments day after day, mended carefully to stretch their use. A laundress's dress might be bleached pale from hours spent scrubbing linens. A scullion's apron might be darkened permanently from soot and grease. These stains were badges of their work, impossible to fully wash away, woven into the very threads of their lives. Clothing also carried hints of hierarchy. Senior servants, a steward, a lady's maid, or a butler, often dressed better than the junior ones. They might have finer fabrics, tailored to fit, perhaps a small piece of jewelry or a more elaborate cap. Their clothing set them apart, showing their proximity to the nobility. A lady's maid, for instance, might wear dark but well-cut dresses, plain enough to signal humility, but fine enough to reflect her mistress's taste. The care of clothing was itself part of the servant's labor. Laundry was an endless cycle in palaces, soaking, boiling, scrubbing, wringing, drying, pressing. It was heavy work, often done by women whose own garments never saw the same level of care. The irony was quiet but sharp. They labored to keep silks gleaming and lace immaculate, even as their own woolen gowns grew thin and their aprons frayed at the edges. Seasons, too, dictated what they wore. In winter, layers were added, cloaks of rough wool, mittens, scarves of thick linen. Still, the cold of stone corridors could seep into their bones, making even the warmest fabric feel inadequate. In summer, sweat darkened collars and sleeves, fabric clinging in the heat of kitchens or sunlit courtyards. Servants did not have wardrobes filled with choices. They endured with what they had, adapting through necessity, not luxury. Yet clothing could also be a quiet comfort. A cap well fitted, an apron freshly laundered, a patch carefully sewn, these small touches gave dignity. Some servants took pride in presenting themselves neatly, even in modest dress. A polished shoe, a tidy hem, a carefully tied kerchief, these were the details that whispered self-respect, even when life gave little chance for grandeur. And there was ritual in undressing, too. At night, servants shed their aprons, folded their wool garments, and slipped into shifts or shirts for sleeping. These garments were often the simplest of all, yet they offered a rare moment of softness, a pause between one day's toil and the next dawn's labor. If you close your eyes, you might imagine the sight: a line of servants moving through a corridor, their clothing muted against the brightness of the palace tapestries. Their aprons swaying as they walk, their shoes clicking softly on stone. Nothing about their garments draws attention, and yet together, they form the quiet fabric of palace life itself. And in the background, the sound of cloth being brushed clean, steady strokes echoing gently into the evening air. Straw mattresses and shadowed rooms, the sleeping quarters of servants. When the palace day drew to a close, when the great halls had emptied of music and laughter, when the lords and ladies retreated into chambers scented with rosewater and warmed by heavy quilts, the servants, too, sought their rest. But their sleeping places were far removed from the glow of luxury. Servants' quarters were not meant to impress. They were meant to contain. Palaces were vast, yet the spaces given to servants were narrow, tucked into corners, stairwells, or upper floors where ceilings sloped low and air grew thin. These were the rooms that guests would never see, the rooms that whispered of necessity rather than grandeur. Beds were simple, if one could call them that. Many slept on straw mattresses laid directly on wooden frames or even on the floor. The straw was replaced only when it grew too flat or too foul. Sheets, if present, were coarse linen, scratchy to the skin. Blankets were woolen, heavy, often patched and rough. A noble might sink into feather-stuffed cushions, while a scullery maid curled beneath a single threadbare coverlet, the chill of stone walls pressing close. Privacy was rare. Servants usually shared their rooms, sometimes packed tightly, row after row of straw pallets. In the kitchen's upper chambers, several boys might sleep side by side, their heads propped on rolled-up garments. In the maids' quarters, a dozen young women might share a loft, their whispered conversations lulling one another to sleep. It was crowded, but in that closeness lay a kind of companionship. Some slept in places that were not meant for sleeping at all. A footman might doze on a bench near the hall, waiting in case his master called. A stable boy might curl in a stall beside the horses, their warmth warding off the cold. A laundress might rest on a pile of folded linens, too exhausted to climb to her chamber after a long day. The palace swallowed their labor, and it swallowed their rest as well. The hierarchy reached even into these sleeping spaces. Senior servants had chambers of their own, modest yet separate, often near the rooms of the nobles they served. A lady's maid might sleep just beyond her mistress's door, so that she could be summoned at any hour. A butler might have a chamber close to the cellars, guarding the wine as much as resting beside it. These rooms were still plain, but the privacy they offered was a mark of status. For the majority, though, the night was shared. Snores filled the air, mingled with the rustle of straw, the creak of wooden beams, the muffled coughs of the weary. The smell of sweat, smoke, and damp wool lingered in those quarters. Windows, if there were any, were small, letting in little air. In winter, frost crept along the edges of walls. In summer, heat pooled beneath the roof, stifling and heavy. Yet for all its discomfort, rest was precious. A servant's body craved it, even when sleep was short. Days began before dawn, and nights stretched late. Sometimes only a few hours of rest stood between one day's toil and the next. Sleep was not a luxury, but a necessity to keep limbs strong and hands steady. There were small rituals that softened the nights. A maid might braid her hair before lying down, whispering a prayer for strength. A kitchen boy might clutch a wooden charm or a scrap of cloth given by his mother far away. Friends in the dormitory might trade soft words, stories of home, or simple jokes to ease the day's weight. Then, one by one, their voices would fade, replaced by the steady rhythm of breathing, the quiet chorus of shared fatigue. Dreams, too, belonged to them. Though their waking hours were bound by duty, sleep was the one realm where their minds wandered free. A stable boy might dream of galloping across fields instead of mucking stalls. A chambermaid might dream of fine gowns she would never wear. A cook's apprentice might dream of a table where he, too, could eat his fill. These dreams, fragile and fleeting, were a kind of rebellion, private luxuries no master could claim. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it, the palace at night, noble chambers glowing faintly with candlelight, while high above or deep below, the servants' quarters hum softly with breath and sleep. Crickets outside, a faint drip of water from stone gutters, the distant crackle of a dying fire. The palace slumbered in two worlds, one gilded, the other humble. And in those hidden corners, wrapped in wool and straw, the servants rested, their dreams flickering quietly in the dark. And in the background, the last embers in the hearth glowed faintly, fading into silence. The endless rhythm of chores, sounds that filled the palace. If one stood in the center of a great palace, and if one listened not to the music of harps or the chatter of nobles, but instead to the deeper hum of daily life, one would hear the servants. Their labor was the pulse of the building. Their chores never ceased, moving in patterns as steady as breath itself. Every palace had its own symphony of sound. Not the grand music of feasts, but the quieter orchestra of work. The scrape of broom bristles on stone. The clink of wooden buckets filled with water. The muffled thump of rugs being beaten free of dust in a courtyard. The creak of doors opening to corridors where only servants walked. Morning began with the crackle of kindled fires. Kitchen hearths roared to life, pans were set down with dull clangs, ladles stirred broths that simmered slowly. The smell of wood smoke and boiling herbs filled the air long before nobles rose from their feather beds. The scullery boys, still half asleep, splashed water as they scrubbed yesterday's pots, their hands reddened by cold. Floors were swept with steady strokes. Some palaces laid rushes along the ground, and these had to be replaced often. The task was endless, carrying bundles of dried reeds, scattering them, then sweeping them clean again when food and dirt collected. A servant bent low to the ground, wrist aching, yet the rhythm of broom against stone was as familiar as breath. Linen was carried to the wash. Great baskets piled high with sheets, napkins, and gowns were hauled to laundries. There, women bent over tubs, scrubbing until their fingers were raw, beating cloth against boards, rinsing in cold water, wringing until arms shook. Steam rose in winter from vats of boiling water, filling the laundry with damp warmth. In summer, wet linens hung from ropes, fluttering pale and ghost-like in the courtyard air. In the halls, furniture was polished. Servants crouched with cloths, rubbing beeswax into wood, until tables and chairs gleamed. Brass handles were buffed until they reflected candlelight. Tapestries were brushed, their colors revived, their threads freed of dust. Nobles might pass through such spaces without pause, never knowing how many hours of labor kept the halls ready for their admiration. Outside, gardeners tended the palace grounds. They clipped hedges, pruned fruit trees, raked gravel paths into perfect lines. They rose before dawn to water herbs, to scatter seeds, to pull weeds with patient fingers. In grand palaces, their labor stretched endlessly, sculpting hedges into pleasing forms, arranging flower beds by season. Their hands were calloused, their backs bent, yet their work blossomed into beauty that nobles praised without thought of the toil behind it. Chores followed cycles, predictable yet unending. Once one was finished, another began. Sweep, scrub, polish, carry, mend. The rhythm never ceased, like waves against the shore. Some tasks were small, folding napkins, filling lamps with oil, arranging cutlery. Others were heavy, hauling barrels from cellars, lifting stones, rolling carpets too large for a single pair of hands. The air itself carried these sounds. In the kitchens, the thud of knives on chopping blocks, the hiss of meat against iron pans. In corridors, footsteps echoed, quick and light, for servants were trained to move swiftly without drawing notice. In stables, horses snorted and stamped, grooms' voices murmuring in steady tones to calm them. Overseers kept watch, their voices sharp, cutting through the hum of labor. A reprimand here, a reminder there, pushing the rhythm forward. To slacken, to pause too long, was to invite scolding. Servants worked under the weight of expectation, their movements forming a hidden current that kept the palace flowing. Yet there were softer sounds too. A chambermaid humming quietly as she dusted a mantle. Two kitchen girls whispering while they chopped vegetables, their laughter muffled by the clang of pots. A stable boy whistling to his favorite horse, the notes thin but cheerful in the cool air. These small sounds were not duties, but comforts, gentle threads woven into the fabric of labor. For many servants, chores became a kind of second nature. Their hands moved almost without thought, sweeping, scrubbing, polishing, pouring. The repetition, though wearying, could also lull the mind. Some found rhythm in it, a way to let thoughts drift quietly while the body labored. In this sense, the palace itself was like a great clock. Its hands were the servants, turning steadily, marking time through action. Still, exhaustion was a constant companion. By midday, muscles ached, backs bent low, fingers cramped from endless repetition. Yet the tasks continued, stretching into the afternoon, into the evening, until lamps had to be lit and halls prepared once more for noble eyes. And then, when the day's work seemed complete, the cycle simply began again, waiting at the next dawn. If you close your eyes, you might hear it now. The quiet hum of brushes on wood. The splash of water poured from a bucket. The faint rhythm of cloth wrung and twisted. A palace was not truly silent, not even when nobles believed it so. Its silence was an illusion. Beneath it, the servants' endless music carried on, steady and unbroken. And in the background, the broom kept sweeping, its bristles whispering softly across the stone floor. Washing bowls and quiet water, cleanliness in the life of servants. Cleanliness in palaces was not only a matter of health, but of appearance. The nobles who dwelled in lofty chambers expected their surroundings to gleam, their clothing to be spotless, and their bodies to be tended with scented baths. For the servants who labored beneath them, however, cleanliness took on a different rhythm, not luxurious, not perfumed, but practical, humble, and often hard one. The day often began with water. Servants fetched it in buckets from wells, cisterns, or pumps hidden within the palace grounds. Water was heavy, and it sloshed as it was carried along long corridors. Nobles would later wash their faces in this water, perhaps with the touch of rosewater or lavender to sweeten the scent. But before the nobles touched it, the servants' own skin was already damp from the labor of fetching it. For servants themselves, washing was brief and utilitarian. They did not step into marble baths. Instead, they splashed their faces with cool water in basins, rinsed their hands, rubbed their arms with coarse cloths. Sometimes they added ashes or sand to scrub away grease and dirt. Soap, when available, was plain and harsh, made of animal fat and lye. It stung cracked skin, but it served its purpose. A chambermaid might wash her hands and face quickly in the morning before tying her linen cap. A scullery boy, his arms blackened with soot, might scrub them with ash until his skin burned. A laundress, forever surrounded by tubs of water, might dip her hands in for her own washing when her labor was done. But thorough baths were rare, reserved for days when duties allowed a stolen hour, or when the palace itself demanded full cleansing of its staff. Clothing, too, was central to cleanliness. Servants' garments were washed as often as possible, though not with the frequency of noble attire. Wool absorbed odors, linen yellowed with time, aprons grew stained with grease and ash. Laundresses boiled and scrubbed garments in great tubs, then dried them in courtyards. The servants who wore them felt both the comfort of fresh cloth and the sting of garments that stiffened with rough washing. Hair was kept tidy out of necessity. Women plaited their hair tightly or tucked it beneath kerchiefs and caps. Men kept their hair cropped short, sometimes with uneven cuts made by fellow servants. A neat appearance was demanded, for nobles expected their households to reflect order. Yet the care of hair was done with simple means: combs of wood or bone, oils when affordable, or simply water to slick down unruly strands. Cleanliness was not just for the servants' own bodies. Much of their labor was spent in cleaning the palace itself. Floors were swept daily, rushes replaced, and corridors sprinkled with herbs to mask odors. Tables were scrubbed, chamber pots emptied, linens laundered. Servants moved through these rituals quietly, their own hands and clothes growing dirtier as the palace itself grew cleaner. Some palaces offered small bathhouses or washing rooms for servants, though these were modest compared to the ornate baths of their masters. A tub of wood filled with lukewarm water, shared among many, might be the closest a servant came to true bathing. After long days of labor, sinking into such water was a luxury, though it was fleeting and often crowded. Season dictated much. In winter, washing was painful, the water biting cold, fingers red and stiff from contact. In summer, washing became a relief, a chance to cool the body and rinse away sweat. Seasons shaped the very smell of the servants' world: wood smoke and wool in winter, damp linen and sweat in summer. Cleanliness also carried a moral weight. In Christian palaces, washing was often linked with ritual purity. Servants attended chapel alongside nobles, their appearances expected to be tidy if not elegant. A maid with smudged cheeks or a boy with uncombed hair risked shame, not just for themselves but for the household they represented. To appear neat was to show discipline, obedience, and respect. And yet, despite their efforts, servants often carried the marks of labor upon their skin. A cook's apprentice might always smell faintly of smoke and meat. A laundress might have reddened hands, raw from soap and water. A stable groom might smell of hay and horse, no matter how much he washed. Cleanliness was pursued, but never fully achieved, because their work itself was the source of perpetual dust, soot, and sweat. Still, there was comfort in small routines. The splash of water on a weary face at dawn. The comb drawn carefully through tangled hair. The clean shift put on before sleep. These gestures were not grand, but they restored a sense of dignity, a reminder that even in labor the self could be cared for. Imagine it now, the palace corridors glowing with candlelight at dusk, the air sharp with the scent of soap and damp linen. In a small corner, a servant bends over a basin, cupping water in their hands, rinsing away the grime of the day. The act is quiet, fleeting, but it holds its own kind of peace. And in the background, water drips softly from a basin's rim, echoing gently in the stillness of the room. Servants and secrets, what they saw, overheard, and carried in silence. Palaces were places of grandeur, but they were also places of whispers. Behind the painted ceilings and the carved door frames, behind the ceremonies and the jewels, life in a palace was not always as polished as it seemed. Servants knew this. They saw what others did not. They heard what was meant to be hidden. They moved in the shadows of power, unnoticed, but never unaware. A servant was both present and invisible. Present in the bedchamber, lighting candles, carrying trays, tidying garments. Present in the hall, pouring wine, clearing plates. Present in the chapel, standing near the door. And yet, in the eyes of the nobles, servants were not meant to exist as witnesses. They were like the walls or the rushes, part of the palace itself, not part of its story. But ears hear, even when mouths remain closed. A chambermaid might overhear a quarrel between husband and wife. A page might notice a secret letter being slipped beneath a cushion. A cook might see who ate and who did not. Even a boy sent to fetch firewood could cross paths with someone he should not. Secrecy was woven into the fabric of their work. It was expected. A servant who gossiped openly risked punishment, even dismissal. Discretion was survival. Yet even so, knowledge collected quietly. Palaces were filled with rivalries and intrigues, with alliances formed and broken, with love affairs whispered behind curtains. Servants knew more than the nobles ever imagined. There were small secrets. Which noble favored honey over sugar? Which child cried at night? Which lady slipped her jewels beneath her pillow rather than into her chest? These were harmless, yet they revealed the intimate rhythms of palace life. And then there were larger secrets. Secrets of politics, of money, of passion. A valet might carry a sealed letter across the palace grounds without knowing its words, yet he knew its urgency. A laundress might notice stains on a gown that hinted at scandal. A stable boy might see which guest left quietly in the night. Such things could never be spoken, yet they lingered in memory. Some servants used knowledge to survive. A servant who knew too much might be treated with caution, given bribes of kindness or coin to ensure loyalty. Others traded information quietly, passing whispers from one corridor to another. In times of crisis, a king's illness, a queen's quarrel, a court divided, servants often knew the truth before it reached the public. They stood in the folds of history, hidden but watchful. And yet silence was their shield. To speak too openly was dangerous. Punishments for betrayal could be severe. A dismissed servant risked hunger. A punished one risked worse. So secrets were swallowed, tucked away, carried silently through the years. There was also a strange intimacy in this quiet knowledge. Servants often knew their masters more truly than their peers did. They saw them tired, unadorned, sick, or afraid. They heard their unguarded words, saw their unpolished selves. A noble might present strength to the court, but in the privacy of a chamber, servants saw the truth. Sometimes, servants became confidants. A lonely noble might unburden themselves to a trusted attendant. A maid might be asked to hold a letter, a page to guard a trinket. Loyalty was sometimes rewarded with small trust, though rarely with equality. The bond was fragile, yet it could last a lifetime. And still, gossip flowed quietly among servants themselves. In kitchens, in laundry rooms, in stables, whispers were exchanged. "Did you hear? Did you see?" The palace was a village of its own, with its own networks of talk. Information drifted like smoke, curling from one servant's lips to another's ear. Not all of it was true, but all of it mattered, for it was their way of piecing together the hidden life of the palace. Imagine it now, a long hallway at night, the air heavy with silence. A servant carries a candlestick, light trembling on the walls. From a chamber ahead comes the faint sound of voices, low and urgent. The servant pauses, then moves on, their face calm, their steps steady. They will never repeat what they heard, yet the sound of it stays in their memory. This was the life of servants among secrets. They held them like shadows, always present, never spoken. The palace glittered with gold and ceremony, but beneath it all, it rested upon the quiet discretion of those who served. And in the background, the soft creak of a closing door faded into stillness, leaving only the hush of silence behind. The hidden world of servant friendships and bonds. Life in a palace could be heavy with work, strict with rules, and distant with hierarchy. Servants were expected to obey, to labor, to remain almost invisible. But beneath these layers of duty, something gentler endured. Servants found one another. They formed friendships, small communities, and ties of care that softened the weight of their days. These friendships began in the smallest places. Two maids folding linen side by side. Two boys carrying wood together down the same corridor. A cook and a scullery maid exchanging weary glances as the ovens roared hot and the air filled with steam. Shared labor created shared understanding. No one else quite knew the strain of scrubbing floors for hours, or the ache of standing long in the great hall, or the chill of fetching water before dawn. Among themselves, servants found that they did not have to explain. In the kitchens, laughter sometimes rose above the clatter of pots. A joke told quietly, a story whispered as hands chopped herbs or kneaded dough. In the laundry rooms, women hummed as they beat linen against boards, their voices weaving together in soft harmony. Even in the stables, where the smell of hay and horses filled the air, boys teased one another as they brushed coats and carried buckets. These were small things, yet they gave life texture. Friendships also offered protection. A servant alone might be scolded or dismissed, but a servant with friends could find support. If one fell ill, another might cover their task. If one grew weary, a friend might share bread or lend a blanket. In a palace that often valued them only for their labor, servants valued each other for their humanity. Sometimes bonds grew deep enough to feel like family. Older servants took younger ones under their wing, teaching them how to avoid angering a master, how to move quietly, how to endure. These lessons were rarely spoken formally. They were passed in glances, in gentle warnings, in the gift of a tip learned long ago. And sometimes, affection blossomed into love. The palace, with its corridors and courtyards, offered both secrecy and closeness. A maid and a groom might find reasons to meet in the stables at dusk. A kitchen boy and a laundress might linger together after their work was done. Such relationships were fragile, for discovery could mean dismissal, yet they persisted. Love found its way even in places of discipline and duty. There were rivalries too, of course. Servants competed for favor, for lighter tasks, for better rooms. But even amidst rivalries, bonds held firm. Shared hardships outweighed differences. After all, nobles could change with marriage, death, or politics, but the servants remained, bound to the palace and to one another. Festive days brought friendships most fully to life. When a feast was over, when the nobles had retired, the servants might gather quietly, sharing leftover bread, a cup of ale, or simply stories. On holy days they sometimes attended church together, walking side by side in modest clothing. In those moments, they were not merely hands that polished or voices that answered. They were a community, breathing and living together. There was also comfort in small rituals. Two friends might always meet at a certain corner of the courtyard to share a morning word. A maid might braid another's hair before chapel. A boy might save the best piece of bread crust for his closest companion. Such rituals were tiny, almost invisible, but they wove trust and warmth through the long fabric of days. Imagine it now, the palace at night, the grand halls silent, torches burning low. In the servants' quarters, two friends sit on wooden stools, sharing a crust of bread and a few quiet words before sleep. Their shoulders are weary, their hands rough, yet their laughter is soft, a fragile flame in the shadows. These friendships did not make the palace easy, but they made it bearable. They gave servants strength, joy, and a reason to rise again with the dawn. Beneath the grandeur of kings and queens, beneath the glitter of jewels and feasts, it was these small bonds that truly sustained the hidden life of the palace. And in the background, the murmur of low voices drifted into the hush of night, mingling with the steady crackle of the hearth. The quiet sleep of servants, rest between duties. As the palace settled into evening, the grandeur of candlelight and music slowly faded. The lords and ladies retired to their chambers, their beds thick with feathers and silk. The servants, too, had tasks to finish, but eventually, even their bodies demanded rest. Sleep for a servant was different from sleep for the noble. It was often shorter, harder one, yet deeply necessary. Servants rarely had the luxury of private chambers. Many slept in shared rooms, crowded with straw pallets, simple mats, or thin mattresses. The scent of hay, the warmth of bodies pressed close together, and the faint smell of fire from the hearth combined to create a world all their own. Privacy was a gift, rarity made precious. Even in such crowded spaces, small gestures marked individuality. A neatly folded apron, a carefully placed water jug, or a tiny charm tucked beneath a pillow. Sleep was earned after long days. After tending kitchens, polishing floors, carrying water, lighting fires, and attending to nobles' whims, servants finally lay down. Their muscles ached, their hands stiff and raw from labor. They sank into their straw mattresses, listening to the hush of the palace, a hush that was never complete, but always quieter than the bustling day. The rhythm of sleep was punctuated by duties that might arise even in the night. A chambermaid might be called to light a lamp in a master's bedroom. A footman might be needed to carry a message across a quiet corridor. Even as they rested, servants remained alert, bodies trained to respond to necessity. Their sleep was deep yet cautious, broken yet restorative. Many developed ways to find comfort despite hardships. A maid might wrap herself in a worn wool blanket, the rough fabric still offering warmth. A kitchen boy might rest his head on a rolled-up shirt or apron, forming a makeshift pillow. A stable boy might drift off beside the horses, their warmth seeping through the cold of stone floors. Each servant adapted to the circumstances, creating a small sanctuary of sleep amid the demands of duty. Dreams were precious. They were a space where labor, rules, and hierarchy could be forgotten. A laundress might dream of fields and meadows far from the palace. A scullery boy might imagine feasts where he could eat freely, without waiting for scraps. A chambermaid might drift into worlds of silk and candles, imagining herself not as invisible labor, but as a person with choices, with time, with freedom. These dreams were fleeting, fragile, yet they carried solace. There was also companionship in shared sleep. In crowded quarters, friends and colleagues lay close together. Even the quiet breathing of another, the soft rustle of fabric, became a reminder that no one was entirely alone. A whispered joke, exchanged before sleep, lingered in the mind and eased the ache of exhaustion. In such small ways, servants created warmth in a world that often left them cold. Seasons shaped the experience of sleep. In winter, chill stone floors and drafty rooms made every layer of fabric essential. Blankets, shawls, and woolen garments were tucked around bodies, creating pockets of warmth. In summer, heat pressed down, and servants shifted restlessly, seeking cool corners, windows, or the slight breeze drifting through the halls. Nature intruded subtly. The smell of rain on stone, the distant hoot of an owl, the gentle rattle of shutters in wind, blending with human sleep to form a lullaby unique to palace life. Evening routines were part of this rhythm. Baths, washes, and small acts of grooming helped to signal the transition from labor to rest. A servant might pause, cup water in their hands, wipe soot and sweat from skin, comb hair into place, fold garments carefully. These acts, repeated nightly, created a sense of order and peace, a small ceremony marking the end of a day spent in ceaseless motion. The palace, from above, seemed silent at night, but below, the servants' quarters hummed quietly. A footstep here, a door closing there, the faint murmur of voices or the shuffle of blankets, all were part of the hidden life of rest. In these shadows, servants rested not only their bodies but also their minds, finding solace in small comforts, in proximity, in routine. Imagine the scene, a dormitory filled with straw pallets, the moonlight spilling in through high windows, the scent of hay and wood smoke mingling. Friends lie close together, sharing warmth and quiet conversation. Slowly, Their breathing synchronizes, soft and steady. The palace above sleeps in grandeur, while below, hidden hands, weary muscles, and devoted hearts find the stillness they have earned. And in the background, the faint sigh of wind through stone corridors mingles with distant dripping water, a lullaby that carries them into the quiet drift of sleep. Reflections and the Invisible Life, the legacy of palace servants. As dawn approached, even the grandest halls of a palace waited for the hum of daily life to resume. But long before the nobles stirred, the servants were already in motion. Their world, often unseen and uncelebrated, was vast, intricate, and quietly essential. Each corridor swept, each dish polished, each footstep taken was part of the unseen machinery that kept the palace alive. Servants lived in cycles. Work, rest, companionship, obedience, secrecy. These patterns repeated endlessly. Days flowed into nights, seasons into years. And yet, even in repetition, there was nuance. Each task carried small choices. Each interaction, a subtle exchange of trust, support, or quiet amusement. Each moment was a thread, woven into the hidden tapestry of palace life. The legacy of these lives is subtle, almost imperceptible, yet it is everywhere. Polished floors, gleaming silver, fragrant kitchens, orderly chambers, all bore the marks of invisible hands. No painting, no tapestry, no chronicle wrote of them directly, yet their labor shaped the very spaces we now imagine when we think of palaces. Servants were observers as much as laborers. They saw joy and grief, splendor and secrecy, celebrations and sorrow. They bore witness to history in its private moments, to the choices of those who ruled, to the scandals that never reached public ears. Their perspective was humble, yet intimate. They understood the palace not as a monument of power alone, but as a living, breathing place, sustained by countless small actions performed quietly, faithfully, day after day. There was endurance in their lives. Few possessions, modest food, simple clothing, hidden rooms, long hours, yet they persisted. They built routines that allowed them to survive physically, socially, and emotionally. Friendships and quiet loyalties became sustenance, a way to carry their spirits along with their bodies. In laughter shared over a crust of bread, in whispered stories in the dormitory, in gentle care between colleagues, they found the human threads that gave meaning to an often unyielding world. Some servants remained in a palace for decades. They watched generations of nobles rise and fall. They trained new servants, passing on skills, cautionary tales, and quiet wisdom. Some left and carried their knowledge into other houses, spreading habits, practices, and stories. In this way, the life of a servant, though invisible to many, shaped the world beyond the walls of a single palace. And yet, for all their importance, they were rarely remembered. History often speaks of kings and queens, of battles, of decrees and titles. Rarely does it linger on the hands that polished the silver, on the eyes that watched the corridors, on the hearts that endured hardships so that another's life could shine uninterrupted. Yet, in imagining their days, we honor them quietly, tracing their steps, sensing their rhythms, understanding their patience. To close one's eyes on this reflection is to imagine the palace as it truly was. The tapestries glow softly in the morning light, the floors gleam, the kitchens smell of bread and herbs. Nobles awaken, and somewhere in the corridors, a scullery boy lifts a ladle with steady hands. Somewhere in the dormitory, a chambermaid untangles her hair before another long day. The palace hums, alive in both splendor and labor, each world entwined, each necessary. The life of a servant was invisible, but it was also enduring, rich with the small details that sustained both palace and person. It was rhythm and routine, hardship and tenderness, secrecy and companionship. It was a life that mattered quietly, deeply, in ways that history often forgets, yet which continued to echo through the polished floors, the soft rustle of linen, the gentle creak of wooden beams. And now, if you let your thoughts drift among these corridors, if you imagine the hush of servants' quarters, the quiet footsteps on stone, the soft warmth of shared blankets, you can feel the gentle persistence of those lives. And as you breathe, as the palace rests around you, so too can your own mind settle, carried on the slow, steady rhythm of their enduring, invisible work. And in the background, a hearth crackles faintly, the soft glow mingling with the hush of the night, carrying you gently toward rest. Thank you for walking quietly through the hidden world of palace servants. Their lives were humble, disciplined, and often unseen, yet they sustained the splendor of history. As you rest, imagine the soft footsteps in empty corridors, the warmth of simple blankets, the gentle rhythm of work and sleep. Let these quiet images carry you into calm slumber, steady and untroubled. Sleep now, with the gentle pulse of history beside you.